I think we're live.
Are we live?
I think so.
Okay.
It says we're live.
Cool.
Look at that. Hey there, welcome to In the Foyer. Dalen and I are in the foyer today, and we're ready to have a conversation about the sermon that we had on Sunday. We were just remarking that it's really difficult to remember all the way back to Sunday after we've been used to doing this on Mondays.
Yeah.
And I don't know about you, but I really enjoyed having a holiday Monday. It was really nice.
Yeah.
And I hope that you've had a really good holiday too.
I always forget about Labor Day.
Right? Yeah.
I completely forgot. I was like, right, this long weekend. I did that.
I was thrilled to wake up on Monday morning and to be like, I'm going to work around my house today. We picked pears this weekend, and so we processed pears all day Monday, and it was just nice to putter around the house. I hope that you had a great Labor Day, whatever labor that you found to do. But let's do in the foyer. We do a recap on Sunday's sermon, and Sunday was Deuteronomy 28, and I guess that was me on behind the pulpit this week.
That was you behind the pulpit preaching that massive text.
Hey, we didn't read all of it.
We did not read all of it.
We didn't read all of it. And a major thank you to those who are like on the ball to be like, yeah, I'll read when we needed extra scripture reading. So appreciate the volunteer support there.
Yeah. So Ryan, what did we talk about? What did you preach?
If I was going to try a nutshell, a fairly broad, spread out kind of sermon, it felt, I think this is what it came down to, is you get the first 14 verses of Deuteronomy 28 where God spells out, if you will diligently observe the commands, and he's talking to Israel, if you'll diligently observe the commands, then there's going to be blessing in every possible way. I really think that echoes the kind of blessing that God just kind of shares for creation right at the very beginning, where we started this sermon series in Genesis 1, is like God creates things and he just speaks blessing over them. He wants flourishing abundance, and he's like, if you follow my ways, you're going to have all of this flourishing abundance. And you kind of get that hint of Eden-ness, of restoration. And then you get the rest of them, which is verses 15 to 68. Which are, if you will not diligently observe all of the commandments that I give you today, then you will be cursed and devastated in every possible way that you can imagine. And you're just sort of and so we really sunk into that, and it's this really feels like a downer. And basically what I tried to say was all of the curses that God speaks over Israel for their disobedience are curses that are intended to discipline Israel towards the mission of restoring the world to look like the blessings. And so he's promised to Abraham that Abraham's family is going to be a blessing to all of the nations. And he wants total restoration, not only for Israel, his kind of chosen people, but for the whole world. And all of the curses are basically saying, you will not flourish to Israel. You will not flourish apart from God and apart from faithfulness to these commandments. And I want flourishing for everyone. And so I feel like that there's a nutshell to boil down to, is the curses are actually aimed towards the blessings. We talked for a little while about the way that those curses are actually they're not that bad as you compare them to sort of the war crimes and the terrible atrocities that people commit against each other. And so it's this is terrifying and it's scary.
But this just happens.
But it's
actually.
That happens whether you're the covenant people of God or not. This is what people do to each other, and God is saying you'll be exposed to the same kind of sinful ruin that the world is experiencing.
Yeah, this is still something that happens today. This is something going on. This is a reality for a lot of people.
A lot of countries today. Yeah. So anyway, that's kind of where we went. God desires a total restoration of the world, and he's willing to discipline his people toward that the mission of being involved in that. And he's not willing to say that he'll just sort of bless and provide for things that are totally twisted, broken, and evil. That's kind of the sense that I have.
Are you telling me that God won't just bless whatever I do, regardless of...
I mean,
I can't just do whatever I want, right?
I think what I'm saying is that if you build a business that's based around exploiting people, and you ask God for a blessing over let's say you're doing human trafficking, child labor and sexual trafficking, that God doesn't want that for his world,
right?
And he will not bless you with flourishing.
But God helps those who help themselves, right? I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
I don't think so. But I mean, I appreciate the joke.
I am being sarcastic.
Big time. Yeah, no. We're not. Yeah, not going there. So that's kind of what we talked about. I think that's a faithful way to read the text. Is to say this is what God desires. This is restoration.
I think that's exactly
so. Yeah.
All right. So that's what we talked about.
That's what we talked about.
You did mention that you had a lot of things that you didn't talk about.
There were many things that we didn't talk about. And part of that is because we've got like this this massive passage, and we didn't really go verse by verse through all the details of those. Just kind of talked about blessing and curse in general. But yeah, I've got a few things that it's like we didn't talk about this at all. One of the things we didn't talk about was, since this is a word to ancient Israel,
yes,
and not to us, like directly, right? Like that blessing curse. You can apply the principle, but like it's like, how do you apply the principle, and how do we claim this as a word? It's like these are our scriptures, and particularly if this is primarily a command, like you must diligently observe the commandments of the Lord your God. Deuteronomy is full of these commandments that it's like, well, then does that mean that we need to live according to those? And we didn't talk about the way that it's like, we didn't talk about the way that Deuteronomy is a culturally specific document that's aimed to a certain time and place and people, right. And that the sort of the regulations are aimed towards the principles that God really cares about. Right. God still cares about the principles of love your neighbor as yourself, love the Lord your God with all your heart. To be like overly simplistic, but like those are the core that Deuteronomy aims at. Yeah. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we would then adopt all of the shapes of that. And so, for example, the example that came to mind for me when I was doing my pre-writing was like, what about all of the death sentences in Deuteronomy? And that's a fairly timely sort of question for us in fairly recent decades. I think it was it the early 70s that Canada finally said, I think that was the last time that an execution happened in Canada. Right. Which is not that long ago.
No, it's not.
And it was like just normal practice for the world, basically. Mm-hmm. And in many places of the world, it still is normal practice, is capital punishment for these transgressions. But not many places that I know of, not many places, and certainly not, I don't think in Canada, would you find the death penalty for dishonoring your mother and father.
Right.
Or for adultery.
Right.
And yet you find those spelled out in Deuteronomy. And it's like, well, I actually think that the culture, our society is doing better without the death penalty. I'm sorry if that is a politically hot button topic for you. I don't mean to say that so nonchalantly, but among my friends, we've just sort of assumed, what a great thing that we don't kill people for their crimes. Yeah. Again, like I say, that's a very nonchalant thing to say, but I think that's a great thing. So you read Deuteronomy, and it's like, well, does that mean that we're being unfaithful to the text because we don't kill people who sleep together outside of marriage and like betray each other in spouses? It's like, I don't think so. And so we didn't really touch that at all to say how do we appropriate this text for ourselves. And basically, like the bottom line answer that could spur into a bigger conversation that I have even researched is, how is it do we appropriate this law for ourselves? It's not directly to us, and we're not being unfaithful to Deuteronomy by not living according to those specific instructions for behaviors and lifestyles, primarily because we live in a different cultural context, and it would not mean the same thing. It doesn't mean love your neighbor the way that it meant love your neighbor in that context. Right. That's a difficult thing when you're talking about the death sentence and death penalty, but we didn't talk about that, and that's as far as I can go with you there today. Feel free to leave us a question or a comment if you want to, and we can talk more. To that, like kind of along a similar line, I've got my notepad here, just full disclosure of like what are the things that we didn't talk about. A similar line in terms of like context and genre. We did not talk about the whole genre of blessings and curses. Right. So that this is a regular like feature in ancient covenants is something that we didn't talk about at all. The same way that like, when we were back in Genesis talking about Abraham's kind of like the gauntlet of animals that the fire pot floats through, and God is saying like Abraham's there incapacitated on the ground, and God's like, I'm going to take the whole onus of this on myself by walking between these, and basically the whole, like I believe it's a Hittite practice of having animals and walking between them, saying, if I don't keep up my side of the bargain, I'm gonna let me be like these animals. Just cut me in half, play me out, and God takes all that on himself. So that's a kind of contract. We compared that to like signing your name, signing your contracts, making these covenants that we do today, where you like sign for your mortgage. This is another part of that, like sign for your mortgage, where it's like this is like the liability agreement, basically.
Right.
And blessings and curses were a common way for people to express their commitment, to say, I will. If I don't hold up my side of the agreement, then let all of these consequences happen. And if you don't hold up your side of the agreement, then let all these happen to you. But if you're faithful, then let all this. And so it actually just makes genre sense for there to be like 14 verses of blessing and then like heaps and heaps and heaps of curses. Like that fits the genre really well for the time. It's like that's just how people wrote these documents. It's the same way that we would pick up maybe the same way you pick up a newspaper and it reads differently than a novel. It's like that just fits. It's a type of document. Right. This blessing and curse section kind of just fits here. If anyone wants to say hi to the squirrel that just ran across the step out here, feel free. Little black squirrel. So we didn't talk about genre, and that's another piece where it's like, how do we interpret this as a word to us? It's like, well, that genre doesn't really exist for us in the same way, but so you have to sort of make a couple bridges and say, like, okay, well, how do we receive this word for us?
Yeah.
Another thing that we didn't talk about was just to do a recap of Israel's story, to say like, hey, so we've been through this series, and so we started at creation, fall. We kind of did a little bit of a recap, but I was thinking like it would have been really good to have a sort of a graphic or a storyboard to say this is sort of the development of. Here's the people of Israel. Start with Abraham. Abraham's just a guy and his wife, and they can't even have kids. And miraculously, like God grants them a child. And then from Isaac it multiplies, Jacob and Joseph, and then generations and generations into Egypt, and then out of Egypt. And so we've traced this story, but I kind of wanted to give a sense of. I would love to give a sense of this is one story. This is one sweeping narrative that follows the people of Israel, and answering the question of how is God going to restore the fallen world that is here. And so we didn't really do much of a recap there. Just kind of hinted at it that this is one story. The last piece that I have, that I'm sure there's a lot that we didn't cover. And again, if you have a question that you're like, man, I really wish that you would speak to this, then please feel free to leave a comment on YouTube here. We didn't talk about life in exile. So we talked about Deuteronomy being like, hey, here's the story of exile, and this actually did happen to Israel. We didn't talk about, does exile mean that the people are cut off from God?
Oh yeah.
And really, if you want to explore that a little bit more, reading stories like Esther or Daniel, those are great stories of the people of God in exile. Nehemiah and Ezra are other stories about kind of in those periods. And there's kind of this sense of, wait, if the people of God are receiving all of these curses, does that mean that they're cut off from God and that He's kind of done with them, or like what does that mean?
Right.
And we didn't really touch that. And so life in exile, just to say it really really briefly, is a life where the people of God are still looked after by God, despite the fact that they're estranged from the promised land, despite the fact that they're scattered throughout these nations. You read it in Esther, you read it in Daniel. And you hear about the way that God is planning to restore His people. We got that hint if you read Deuteronomy 28 carefully. He's like, I'll restore you. There was going to be this remnant that I gather in from among all the nations. But we didn't talk about the way that this doesn't mean that God isn't like. This doesn't mean that God does give up on His people.
Right. Yeah.
Too many negatives. Yeah. There's still kind of blessing for Israel, despite the fact that they're scattered through the nations. God still looks after His people and even blesses them and prospers them.
Yeah.
So,
and it's also where that's an interesting thing also, because like it's prior to the exile, I think they probably still believed the old sort of thing of because the old way of thinking about gods was that the god was tied to the land.
Yeah,
and so there's a lot of evidence to suggest that Israel, before the exile, still thought of like Yahweh as the God of Israel.
Oh, like this spot,
this physical geographical location. And then once once you've had people like Ezekiel, who was a priest in exile, hearing directly from God, they were like,
oh, what?
This is the God of the whole universe. And that's when that sort of intense monotheism, like this is the God of the whole world, that's actually where that kind of broke in. And so that's actually like, God actually used the exile to show another part of who he was.
Right.
Or is.
Right.
And that's why, like, yeah, you go from there, you go on to, like, strict, like, there are no other gods. This definitely, like, there was always, no, there are no other gods, but there was like, no, like, this is the real thing. Like, God's the whole world.
Right. It's interesting that you bring that up. That makes me think of a time. I remember being on a plane and looking down at the ocean, over the ocean, and seeing land that I had never set foot on.
Yeah.
And just kind of thinking to myself, I guess God is God here too.
Yeah.
Right, and it was sort of a wake up. We like, all of our habits are so shaped by the places that we occupy and the people who are around us. And so, like, when you move, you have to like rebuild all of your habits. But then you totally move to this entirely strange land, and there's kind of this sense of there's nothing familiar all around me. Like, what do I do? And yet, for God to be God over that whole experience, and like for him to have been God here before I was ever here, is just sort of like there's a wake up call to how big God is. Yeah. No, it's a good word. I'm sure there's other stuff that we haven't talked about, but those are the kind of things that it's like those definitely came to mind, and I thought maybe we should go there. Maybe that'll help us understand and hear this passage. And decided ultimately that we wanted to focus in on the blessings and curses, particularly in terms of this is the kind of world that God is committed to restoring, and especially the line, like, you know, these curses are proof of God's faithfulness. The fact that he actually goes through with this is not a sign that he betrays and abandons Israel.
No, he said he was going to do this.
He said he's going to do it, and he follows through.
He did it.
And he continues to remain committed to his people. So I think that's where we were and where we could have gone. Yeah. So I'm curious, as you hear Deuteronomy 28, as you're thinking about blessings and curses, would you take a different kind of a different tack on it?
I think I have two answers to your question. Is if I were to talk about like exile, I don't think I would have picked Deuteronomy 28.
Right.
I think we talked about that when we were planning this. Like, I don't think I would have gone Deuteronomy.
You're crazy.
I have to build the slides. I was like 68 verses.
68 verses.
Line
by line. Yeah.
No. I probably would have gone like the Second Kings route. I would have just talked the narrative of the actual physical exile itself.
Right.
And then preached something. But
that's one thing. Is like it wasn't the most sort of straightforward, direct move to be like, we're going to preach exile from here.
Yeah. And I think it was fine. Like, it still obviously worked. I would have preached exile from there. I think it was good. I think I probably would have talked about Deuteronomy 28.
Sure.
But my main text would have been like 2 Kings or something.
Yeah.
Anyway, if I was preaching out of Deuteronomy 28 just by itself, yeah, I don't know.
It's so foreign to us in our language to talk about what is it, 54 verses of straight devastation.
Yeah, I like what you talked about, where you said, you said that God's faithfulness, because like God said he would do it and he did it, and like that's actually God's like being faithful. Like he's saying like, you don't do this, I'm going to do this other thing to you. And you're not doing the thing, so I'm going to now curse you. Like, I think one of the things you did that was really good in the sermon was like you talked about how like the God of the Old Testament sort of thing, where it's like God is all wrath or whatever.
Right.
And then Jesus is all love. Except, well, that's not true. Like, Jesus was super judgy actually a lot of the time and like said a lot of really dark things. And the God of the Old Testament, I guess, whatever, is like, actually was very, it's just like the same. It's the same God. I might have gone that direction. I may have talked about like how this was. I think I might have, if I was going to try and go like the how is this text for us kind of route,
Mm-hmm.
I think I may have gone the like, one of the things that I think Scripture is always doing, at least for us, people who are very far removed, is that it's telling us something about God.
Yeah.
At the very least, it tells us something about God. Whether or not it's a command that we have to follow, because I don't think we have to follow the Deuteronomy commands to the letter, necessarily, but it does tell us something about God. So it's like, is he faithful? Yes. Is he, like...
Opposed to the wicked?
Yeah, is he opposed to the wicked?
You get that.
Kind of like what I was even a little bit like what I was jokingly of saying earlier, like where I said like, oh, like I can just do whatever I want. And like God clearly cares how we live.
Yeah.
He clearly cares if we're like, if we say like, God, I'm going to live for you, but then just really, really don't, or I set up like we set up a society that is built off of like oppression and exploitation, which we have, as if God is going to bless that and not rain curses down on it,
that's a whole nother direction we could have gone.
Yeah.
Actually, would be to say like, in what way does this really speak to Canada today?
And the thing is that I think there's a strong current of people wanting to say like, well, with certain laws, like we've allowed these things to happen. Except the thing is that like it's our culture really that we do this thing now. Like it's our laws are really just are like an extension of our culture. Like right. So like in a way like so for instance, one thing that gets people often is talking about whether or not legality is the same as morality.
Okay, so like it's legal for me to use, I don't know, use marijuana.
Sure. Is it morally right?
That's kind of up in the air.
Up in the air. For instance,
is that the kind of question you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Like, but I would have gone like I would have just been like, okay, well, slavery was legal,
right?
And that was like an extension of our culture. We just did slavery. That was just something we did, and that was culturally okay. But was it morally okay? Was that ever something we should have been doing? No. So, my thing, I may have gone like God actually does care how we live, and there are certain systems that we've set up that are actually super problematic, and they need to stop, and like, like you talk to some people about like the residential schools, and they'll say, "Well, that's just how it was back then." I'm like, "That doesn't make it right."
Yeah.
Yes, that's how it was back then, and sure, but now we're living, and we know that it's wrong, and so we actually have to talk about that and like heal some of the wounds or whatever. And like some of the the problems that we have in our world is just because we've lived a certain way that was counter to Scripture.
Right.
And I am not, to be clear, I'm not talking about homosexuality or abortion. Those are not the two things I'm talking about. I'm talking about like systematic racism, wealth inequality, the fact that like every time the housing bubble has burst, the only thing that's really happened is that there's like the rich have gotten richer, and that like group of rich people that has just like consolidated more wealth because they'll just buy out all the houses and then rent them out. So it's like the wealth is going into fewer and fewer hands. Like that's what I'm talking about, where we're like significantly pushing down the poor. I think I may have gone that route.
Right.
And eventually what it's going to do is it's going to just burst, and our society is just going to crumble. Now, hopefully that doesn't happen anytime soon.
Right.
I'd rather not be exiled in some sort of way. But I just mean like...
But that promise of flourishing versus the curses is kind of like, wait, if you continue to do this to each other, you are eroding any kind of fabric, any kind of foundation that your society can stand on.
Exactly.
And
like,
why would you expect God to bless that?
Precisely. Like the very fact that like we will shout until we're blue in the face about like, well, abortion or something, but then not really care about wealth inequality. It kind of just it speaks to where our culture is, and it's like there's a reason that there's so much poverty. There's a reason that there's so much inequality and difficulty for people, because people are just they don't care, or they're not doing anything about it, or we're not pushing back, whatever. So like we need to live this certain way, and if we continue to live in an ungodly way, eventually the fabric of our society will unravel and fall from the bottom out, probably. And you can go into all sorts of things like, why is the church failing? Why, if it's failing at all, why are there fewer young people in church? Well, you can point to a whole bunch of other things, and you could really dig into a lot of societal, historical, and sociological ideas. Anyways, so
could have gone that route, because Deuteronomy is actually relevant to that conversation.
It is. It's deeply relevant. It's deeply relevant to social justice issues. So I may have gone that way.
I feel like Deuteronomy 28 could have been the kickoff for you into a series that says, okay, let's look at what Deuteronomy values and then compare that to what we value as a society. Because what you're describing is like, Deuteronomy is terribly relevant. This particular passage doesn't give you much guidance for what the diligently observe my commands looks like.
Yeah, but
it would be a sweet kickoff.
If you did like a whole series on Deuteronomy, you'd get, because it's basically a summation of the law. Yeah. It's Moses giving the law to the new generation. So it's like, if you want to preach the law, but you don't want to go through all of like Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, just preach Deuteronomy.
Yeah. Well, it feels like in my experience, anyways, it feels like Deuteronomy comes from like a more applied perspective, anyways. Like it's very intensely practical.
Yes.
Where the other ones are like a little bit more like, hey, this is just how the law is.
Yeah.
Deuteronomy's like, okay, well, this is how you apply that.
Yeah, this is how you work it out in real time.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I see. We got a visitor pulling up into here, and I think that we've just about wrapped up what we can talk about today. So I just want to say thanks to Dalen for a great conversation. And again, this final invitation, if you'd like to leave a comment, by all means, we'd love to hear what you're wondering about, what your questions are. And we'll see you next time on In the Foyer.